It is Sunday, August 23rd, 2020. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandajis here with your tropical update, and we have a lot to get to today. A brand new hurricane out there in the Gulf of Mexico, Marco, that developed right around the lunch hour today after an Air Force recon mission found winds strong enough to warrant an upgrade, and we're still watching Tropical Storm Laura that will likely strengthen as that heads towards the Gulf of Mexico as well in the next few days. Before we get into things, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and at the end of the video, if you like what you saw and you learned something, hit that like button as well. Here's the list of names. We're at number 13 now with Marco, and that's the third hurricane of the year. And when we look at climatology, we're a little bit ahead of schedule. On or around September 9th is typically when we see that third hurricane of the season, when we look back from 1966 to 2009. Here's a look at satellite imagery. This is the infrared exposure here, and certainly multiple things grab your attention. The two systems we're watching out there right now. We'll start with Marco, and that's the most imminent threat to the United States here, making landfall in potentially less than 24 hours. Here's how it looks. I mean, the presentation on satellite imagery is much more impressive than it was just 24 to 36 hours ago. Big flare-up of convection or thunderstorm activity, and the reason why we use this filter, the infrared, is it tells us the cloud top temperatures. Why that's important is because it tells us what's going on and how intense the thunderstorm activity is. The colder the cloud tops, the higher up in the atmosphere they are, meaning they're more intense. And when you see the shades of white and the black here, that's intense thunderstorm activity. And notice that last frame, that blow up right around the center of the storm, indicating that some strengthening is ongoing here, despite the influence of wind shear that's coming in out of the south and west. And you can kind of see that here on the visible satellite imagery. It's a little bit lopsided. It's not completely symmetrical. You have most of the thunderstorm activity here displaced off to the north and east side, but overall it is holding its own despite that presence of the wind shear. And if you look really closely on the visible satellite, we do have the central dense overcast that's kind of obscuring any view of a developing eye. But if you look real close here in the last couple of images, you can see that flare up of the convection or the thunderstorm right around the center. So this may be underway of some big time intensification here in the short term, because as we go forward and it gets closer to the Gulf Coast, wind shear is expected to pick up, and that should limit any huge intensification, which will be some good news for places like New Orleans that could be seeing some impacts from the storm. We'll likely be seeing some impacts. So what prompted the upgrade to a hurricane? Tropical storm this whole time, and then today it just popped up to a hurricane. It was expected on the computer models, and it jumped up to 75-mile-an-hour winds. It's because a recon aircraft flew through the storm, and they found winds up and over hurricane force. So that prompted the upgrade today at 12:30 in the afternoon. Now it is again being influenced by the wind shear coming in out of the southwest, which is a big trough of low pressure here off to the north and west of the system, and that eventually is going to help to weaken it. Hopefully in the next 24 hours before it does make landfall. Now, overall, the system, in terms of size, is bigger than where it was 24 hours ago. It has expanded a little bit, but still rather small in the scheme of things, about 350 miles in diameter. But small systems are much more susceptible to not only dry air entraining into the system, but big swings in intensity too, and they are a little more susceptible to being kind of bullied around by the wind shear. Overall, being a small system too, that means the wind field is very small. So we're finding tropical storm force winds that's 39 miles per hour or greater, extending out in the northeast quadrant of things, about 60 miles from the center. And then you have winds up to around 55 or over 55 miles an hour, extending out about 20 miles from the center. So when you look at the size of the storm, 350 miles in diameter, you're only getting tropical storm force winds out 60 miles from the center of it. So the wind field not all that impressive right now, which is a good thing. So what's Marco's prognosis as we go forward from here? Expecting some further strengthening to occur probably within the next 12 hours or so. The sea surface temperatures are certainly warm enough to warrant that intensification. Now, we will see the increasing wind shear ahead of landfall on Monday, potentially somewhere along the southeastern Louisiana coastline, and the storm surge potential is high. Again, that area is very, very susceptible to storm surge, with it being low-lying and some of the area below sea level. So here's how it looks in terms of the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. We're going to get an update here later this afternoon, but this is off of the 11 o'clock advisory. Notice Category 1 hurricane status here by Monday, 8 a.m., 75 miles per hour. It looks to make landfall potentially here in southeastern Louisiana, encountering some of that wind shear and the land interaction should weaken it pretty quickly here. Monday, 8 p.m., we're down to 65 mile per hour winds. We're looking at landfall here probably late morning, early afternoon on Monday. Then as we go a little bit farther out in time, notice it does start to swing and turn to the north and west, because there's a big ridge of high pressure here to the northeast, and that will be helping to steer the storm. If it's a little stronger, this could be suppressed a little farther to the south and southwest, and potentially maybe even scoot the coastline, which wouldn't be a good thing. It'd stay over water longer. And that's actually an indication of a new model that just came out that could be starting a new trend here. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. Out ahead of this storm, numerous watches and warnings are up for almost the entire Louisiana coastline, over into Mississippi and Alabama too. Tropical storm watches and warnings are the yellow and orange, and then the pink or the purple there is the hurricane warnings. Let's refresh ourselves on what watches and warnings mean. Warnings are obviously much more imminent. That means tropical storm or hurricane threats are happening here within the next 36 hours. In fact, much sooner than that, less than 24 hours from now. On top of those watches and warnings, we also have the storm surge threat. So a storm surge warning is up for all of the areas in purple here, and that's because of the overall storm track. We are going to be on what we call the dirty side of the storm. That means we're going to be on the northeast quadrant of the storm track here, and that means a prolonged period of onshore flow piling up the water along the low-lying areas, inundating several spots in what could be feet of water. In fact, here is the peak storm surge forecast from the National Hurricane Center. All of the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama coastlines are exposed to this storm surge from Marco. And in some spots, it could be pretty significant. 4 to 6 foot storm surge is possible. So in terms of wind, again, we're going to be on the side with the strongest winds too, with that storm track coming off to the south and west of the coastline. So probabilities of seeing at least tropical storm force winds are nearly certain here. We're talking 80–90% chances, and just offshore, 100% chances there. In terms of fuel for the storm, it's never been a problem for the system. It's had plenty warm sea surface temperatures from its inception several days ago. And we're talking mid-80s here as it approaches the coastline, even a little bit warmer right along the coastline there. On top of that, with storms as they move over the ocean, they mix it up, something called upwelling. And that tends to bring in the cooler waters from below to the surface, limiting the fuel. But in this case, the warm sea surface temperatures extend down to a depth, in some places, over 100 meters. So when you're upwelling it, you're just upwelling continuously warm water. So that's not going to be a problem for the storm weakening. It's really going to be placing our bets on the wind shear impacting the storm greatly as we go forward. And here's the forecast wind shear on that. You see the forecast cone, and this area here is unfavorable conditions for wind shear, meaning that it's stronger wind shear and that'll tear off the tops of the thunderstorms. It will be heading towards that as it heads towards landfall here. Is it a guarantee? No. That's why we have to watch that carefully there and see how it plays out here pretty much hour by hour going forward. How are the models seeing things here with Hurricane Marco? Well, here's the spaghetti plots. Each line is a different computer model. I mean, in the short term, they're pretty close together, but there's still a considerable spread here, being that we're talking about less than 24 hours potential landfall in Louisiana. So there's still a lot of uncertainty here and what happens. Now, why is that? I talked about that placement of the ridge, right? A big dome of high pressure that's been nosing in from the east and pushing west. And that is extremely even more evident here on the latest runs of our GFS ensemble. This is 21 runs of the GFS, 21 members, kind of tweaking it each time to get a different outcome. This is very concerning because this shows that the high pressure ridge is a little bit stronger, a little bit farther towards the west. Potentially, as this makes its way towards land, towards Louisiana, it does slow down potentially and then take a hard left turn off towards the west. Now, that'll be good for no landfall in Louisiana. That'll be great. But if it stays offshore, we're still talking about a prolonged period of winds and the storm surge. And if it's over water longer, that means it's not away from its fuel source. So we could be looking at a stronger Marco if this plays out and tracks a little bit farther to the west. This will once again put Houston in the area to watch carefully with this system as it moves north. So new developments right there with that GFS ensemble. We'll see if that trend plays out for the later on in the afternoon and evening runs too. Now let's jump over to what's going on with Tropical Storm Laura. On satellite, this presents very well because it's looking healthy despite it being sitting over Dominican Republic and Haiti. Dominican Republic has some of the highest mountain peaks in the entire Caribbean. Pico Duarte, 10,000 foot elevation. So typically we call this area of the Caribbean the shredder. It tears systems apart. But this system has really held itself together. The overall structure is still evident, and we're seeing the spiral cirrus clouds coming on out, meaning that it's ventilating the outflow aloft, inflow at the surface. And if this can make its way all the way through Cuba, which is where the forecast track is, and enters the Gulf of Mexico, we likely have a big problem on our hands, because it's going to be heading into an area where all of the atmospheric conditions are conducive for rapid intensification. We're going to talk about exactly what that means here in just a minute. Here's flipping things up and showing you the visible satellite. Certainly looking healthy. If the islands weren't there, we'd already have ourselves a hurricane. Right now, we only have winds of 50 miles per hour, but still the structure is there. Water vapor imagery, more of the same. We're not talking about dry air being a big factor in kind of slowing the system down. It's got plenty of moisture associated with it, and it's kind of walling itself out from pulling any of that dry air in. Here's the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center. Notice for the next day, day and a half, it does look to travel right over Cuba, but it's really this time frame we need to watch by Monday evening. By 8 p.m. or so, 50-mile-per-hour winds, but this is where its land interaction ends. And this is where it enters the Gulf of Mexico. And in this particular area, too, is where it's very, very warm, sea surface temperatures, and the atmospheric conditions, no wind shear, plenty of moist air, will all be favorable for a system to develop and intensify rapidly. Here's the long-term track as we go on through Thursday of next week, potentially getting all the way up to a Category 2 hurricane before it makes landfall again somewhere between Louisiana and over towards Texas, potentially near the Houston area. These intensity estimates are usually pretty conservative, okay? When you have conditions like there are going to be present in the Gulf of Mexico, we could certainly see a period of time where we see rapid intensification. So that's something to keep in mind here, right, as we go forward. It's certainly going to be probably a system that we have to watch, well, we are going to watch extremely closely. So Laura's prognosis here, if the storm stays structurally sound through the rest of the Caribbean, I have high confidence that we are going to have a major hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico by early next week. Now, the exact track of it is still uncertain because we have to find that weakness in the ridge that we just talked about that's guiding Marco's track as we go forward, too. And all variables are in play here and are conducive for rapid intensification in the Gulf of Mexico. Warm sea surface temperatures, that ocean heat content, the warm water extends down to a depth. And something else that's in play here is something called a loop current. That's pretty much transferring warm water continuously into a part of the Gulf of Mexico where Laura is forecast to track, and the upper level winds are favorable too for ventilation. So very, very interesting stuff. Here's the current sea surface temperatures. I started things here to kind of focus on once it leaves Cuba, if in fact it travels directly over it and enters the Gulf of Mexico. Sea surface temperatures, again, are very, very warm in the mid-80s. Now, a good question to ask or an interesting observation would be, you know, Marco just passed through this exact same area. So typically when we see that happen, it leaves a cold wake as it exits, right? It upwells cooler waters and cools the sea surface temperatures down. But in this area, that's not likely going to happen because the ocean heat content is the highest in the entire Gulf of Mexico because this is where a loop current is located. So it's an area that is favorable for rapid intensification to begin, and you can see the forecast line here, taking it right on through that loop current. And several systems in the past have moved through a loop current in the Gulf of Mexico and have seen rapid intensification get underway. So what exactly is rapid intensification? Well, according to the National Hurricane Center, rapid intensification is an increase in the maximum sustained winds of at least 30 knots or 35 miles per hour in about a day's worth of time. This has played out several times in the last several hurricane seasons, and I would not doubt, in fact, I'm pretty confident that we see that happen with Laura as it enters the Gulf of Mexico. How are the models seeing things here? Again, pretty far out. There is a large spread in that spaghetti plot all the way from the panhandle of Florida all the way to the Houston area, covering a large chunk, in fact, all of the central Gulf Coast by early next week. Here's how it looks on the GFS ensemble. 21 members here. You can really pick out where that ridge of high pressure is. This entire area here, a big bubble that's been pushing and driving this storm tracking off towards the west, and it's going to start driving northwards when it picks out a weakness. Where is that weakness? It could be farther to the east. It could be a little bit farther to the west. That's why anywhere from Houston to New Orleans to Mobile Bay should be watching this very, very closely, especially if it spends a longer time over the Gulf of Mexico and tracks a little bit farther west. We could see a much stronger system here too. Now, as we wrap things up, 2020 so far has been very interesting. We've had 5 landfalling tropical systems so far. If in fact we see Marco and Laura both make landfall, we'd be up to 7. We started things off with Bertha this year that made landfall in South Carolina, Cristobal in Louisiana, Faye in Florida and New Jersey. Remember that one? That was historic. Hannah in Texas. And then, of course, Isaias was our only hurricane landfall so far this year, and that made landfall in North Carolina before traveling north and up into New England. All right, that's the latest here on your Sunday afternoon. We'll have more videos out this evening and through the rest of your week. Until then, you can find me on social media, on Facebook, Meteorologist Tim Pandajis, on Instagram, or on Twitter. Stay informed and enjoy the rest of your weekend.